In this series, Pentrex presents a vintage look at the once mighty MILW Road. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, commonly known as the MILW Road, is the largest railroad to disappear from the map of the United States. At its height, it covered over 11,000 miles of trackage. In Volume 1, we go back to August 1972 and take a look at the motive power that pulled trains over the electrified Rocky Mountain Division, box cabs and Little Joes in the Alberton and Houston area of Montana, in Avery, Idaho on the western edge of Rocky Mountain electrification, and on the magnificent St. Paul Pass. After a forest fire in the Bitterroot Mountains in 1910, legislation was passed prohibiting the use of coal-fired locomotives on that portion of the MILW Road. Due to the fact that oil was expensive and difficult to transport to this desolate area, the MILW Road chose to electrify portions of their main line through the mountain ranges. In 1915, the MILW Road purchased for its prime motive power General Electric's version of the Compound 2882, 84 box cabs paired into 42 motors. Of these, 30 pairs were assigned to freight service as Class EF1 beneath the cab end, with the rest of the body carried on a pair of two-axle powered frames, giving each unit a 2B+B wheel arrangement. The car bodies floated on the running gear and did not carry any drawbar load. The EF1s were semi-permanently connected together, each pair equipped with 16 52-inch drivers. The drivers were powered by 8 traction motors, which delivered 112,750 pounds of tractive effort. A pair of EF1s weighed 576,000 pounds and was 112 feet long. It wasn't uncommon on the MILW Road to see unusual power lash-ups, such as these box cabs paired with an SW9 switcher near Alberton, Montana. As built, these machines were capable of maintaining speeds of 35 miles per hour, and in the 1950s they were rebuilt to allow a top speed of 45 miles per hour. The two-unit locomotives had a continuous rating of 3,340 horsepower at 15.5 miles per hour, but could be worked to 4,100 horsepower for 1 hour, or even up to 5,600 horsepower for 30 minutes. Of more concern than speed was the ability to haul more tonnage, use less fuel, and require smaller crews. Here the train passes over the Yellowstone Trail, U.S. Highway 10, on its way into the yards at Alberton. In the early 1940s, the MILW began to rebuild some of its box cabs to work as booster units. To do this, they removed the cab, cab controls, and pilot truck. These units were then paired with cab units, so 3- and 4-unit locomotives were possible. Each single box cab carried the number of the locomotive with which it worked. There was also a suffix letter, A or B for control or cab units, and C or D for booster units. Depending on the combination of cab units and boosters, the locomotive unit was labeled an EF1, EF2, EF3, or EF5. With the arrival of the new Westinghouse passenger motors in 1919 and the bipolars in 1920, most of the box cab passenger units went to freight service. By the 1960s, the box cabs were disintegrating from metal fatigue, thus making it economically impractical to consider an electrical re-equipping. And compared with other locomotives available, they were slow and underpowered. Hence, they were relegated, for the most part, to the task of being helpers or for hauling local freight. Here we see 3 box cabs and a diesel switcher moving local freight out of the yards at Alberton. The train heads eastbound about 2.2 miles east of Alberton. E45 and its train emerged from 9 Mile Tunnel. When this footage was shot in 1972, these box cabs were 57 years old. Some box cabs remained in service until electrification on the Milwaukee Road ended in 1974. The first box cab to be built now rests at the Lake Superior Museum of Transportation in Duluth, Minnesota, as a reminder of these hard-working machines. In 1950, the Milwaukee brought on a new type of electrified locomotive. This gutsy motor, on its 77-foot 10-inch wheelbase, became the most powerful and efficient single-unit locomotive on the Milwaukee Road, and was fondly called the Little Joe. Classed EF4, this locomotive had an attractive streamlined body made of welded steel with a cab on each end. It stood 16 feet 6 inches from the rail to the top of its locked-down pantograph and was 10 feet 7 inches wide. The body rested on two cast steel frames on center pin castings, located between the first two driving wheels in each frame. The frames were semi-permanently connected with an articulating joint under the center of the cab. This allowed the frames to move sideways several inches to allow the locomotive to negotiate 16% curves. Each frame had 8 47 1/4 inch driving wheels and 4 690 horsepower traction motors. On each end was a four-wheel pilot truck that was non-powered, making the locomotive configuration 2D plus D2. The controller on the Little Joe had 37 notches, compared with 8 notches on diesel throttles. Although originally built to be run singly as a bidirectional locomotive, the Little Joes were modified with a connecting electrical block on one end of the locomotive so they could better meet the needs of the Milwaukee Road. Two Little Joes were connected at their electrical blocks and were run in tandem. This tandem operation provided 10,220 horsepower, which was needed to haul trains through the steep mountainous terrain. Only occasionally did these locomotives require a helper on the most difficult grades. At Avery, Idaho, we catch Little Joe's E74 and E70 headed eastbound for Adair, Roland, and St. Paul Pass Tunnel. Avery was the westernmost point of electrification on the Rocky Mountain Division. At 49 Gulch, a half-mile from the East Yard Throat in Avery, and a train length from the station, the train slows on this S-curve to allow a caboose crew change in Avery. E74 and E70 continue past as the engineer notches up the throttle to 10,000 horsepower from the trolley wire and Montana Power to accelerate the train toward the crest of the Bitterroot Mountains, dividing Montana and Idaho. One of the most breathtaking views in all of United States railroading was the St. Paul Pass. Here, 11 large trestles spanned ravines too large to be filled. In a matter of 5 miles on the pass's west side, the railroad crossed 7 trestles as it climbed through Loop Creek Canyon, around the 10-degree horseshoe curve at Adair, and then through Roland to St. Paul Pass Tunnel. E74 and E70 have gone in the hole for E77 and 3 diesels westbound over Stetson Bridge. The first of these diesels, number 4, is an FP45. The smoke is from ties being burned along the right-of-way, a common practice on the Milwaukee Road. Stetson Bridge is the first high trestle east of Avery, about 4.5 miles from town. The trestle is unique in that it has a deeper girder in its center span. None of the other high steel trestles have this type of girder. Now, the eastbound, led by Little Joe's E74 and E70, comes through the smoking ties and crosses Stetson Bridge. The truss bridge below the trestle carries the dirt road from Wallace, Idaho into Avery. We have been climbing a 1.7% grade since we left Avery, which will continue to Roland. A 3-unit box cab mid-train helper moves across the trestle. Mid-train helpers were often cut in for use on steep grades. Little Joe's E74 and E70 continue across Clear Creek Trestle on the south side of Loop Creek. The box cab helpers seem to float across the sky. Just outside Adair, our train approaches the 850-foot Kelly Creek Trestle. The scenery is breathtaking. The Little Joe's journey to the MILW Road is an interesting one. In 1946, through an arrangement made by the U.S. State Department, General Electric began construction of 20 high-powered electric freight locomotives for the Soviet Union. By September 1948, GE's plant in Erie, Pennsylvania had completed 8 of the locomotives, but shipment was held up because of the Berlin crisis. By October, President Truman ordered an embargo on goods going to the Soviet Union. With 14 of the locomotives ready to ship, the State Department canceled the contract. Since it was too late to cancel delivery of the parts that had been subcontracted out, GE completed the last 6 units, building them to American gauge instead of the larger Russian gauge. In December of 1948, locomotive number 29927 was completed to American gauge and was turned over to the Milwaukee for a 4-month test. The locomotive was numbered 750. probably because of its 8 powerful GE Model 750 traction motors. This EF4 had been built for the lighter wheel loading of the Russian railroad, and it encountered trouble with slippage on its tests on the mountain grades of Montana. The locomotive was also designed to run at 3,300 volts instead of the 3,000 volts that the Milwaukee used. Needless to say, the EF4 did not give a good show, even when tested against the 32 and 33-year-old 2-unit EF1 combination. Everything in the test locomotive was labeled in Russian, and it was considerably shorter than the box cab units, so the crews joked about Joseph Stalin's little engine. They called it a Little Joe, and the name stuck. Adjustments were needed to bring these Little Joes into operation, and since the government was asking a high purchase price for them, the Milwaukee did not jump at the chance to buy the 20 locomotives. But by waiting, they lost 3 to the Chicago South Shore and South Bend, and 5 to Brazil's Paulista Railroad. In August of 1950, the Milwaukee finally bought the remaining 12 locomotives for $1 million. 10 were placed into freight service on the Rocky Mountain Division, and 2 were put into passenger service on the Olympian Hiawatha. The locomotives were converted to American gauge in the railroad's Milwaukee, Wisconsin shops. The slippage problem was resolved by increasing the weight of the Little Joe by 41 tons. Concrete was poured into pans built to fit under the pantograph, and slab iron was welded to the body frame and floors. This increased the tractive effort from 106,000 to 110,750 pounds. The Milwaukee also had to raise the pantograph maximum height from 22.5 feet to 25.5 feet and raise the power on the line to 3,400 volts. With these changes, the Little Joes excelled. The caboose follows the train into St. Paul Pass Tunnel. Little Joe E78 and 3 SD40-2 diesels curve around on a shelf on the east side of the North Fork of the St. Joe River. The train crosses another trestle before entering tunnel number 32 on its westbound trek. New 1973 automobiles ride toward their future owners in the west. Two GE U-25B diesels lead a westbound train into Avery Yards. A box cab helper set moves west in the Avery Yards and parks beside the motor house. A little Joe stands at the ready. Although Little Joes have a bidirectional configuration, in 1964 Joe's E70 through E79 were modified, having their rear controllers removed to accommodate electrical modifications. The rear cab then had its windows plated over with steel, giving the appearance of black painted glass. Thus, it is necessary to turn these locomotives on a turntable. Notice how the Little Joe has run out of the motor house with its pantograph down. It is being run off a power cord from the motor house. The pantograph is put up to power the motor onto the turntable and then is lowered for turning. The Little Joe that we see here, E78, suffered major damage in a wreck at 16 Mile Canyon on May 23, 1966. The Joe was taken to the Milwaukee, Wisconsin shops, where it was rebuilt using EMD diesel F unit parts, including a cab section, louvers, and the very noticeable chrome-plated side grills. Workers on the Milwaukee Road told of being able to recognize the E78 from miles away because the sun reflected off the chrome-plated grills. After turning, the pantograph goes back up and the Little Joe heads off. Little Joe E-78 heads to the east end of Avery Yards to await its train and an assignment to Harleton. Since the rail to the west of Avery was not electrified, this junction saw quite a variety of power. 3 SD-40-2s from Washington State pull a train through the yards. In the foreground are 2 U-33Cs waiting for orders. The diesels stop at the station to let the Little Joe take control on the point. A Little Joe and 3 SD-40-2s were the common lash-up in the last days of electric operation. The masonry building beyond the station is one of the substations where 100 kilovolt three-phase AC power was converted to 3400 volt DC by motor generator sets for the western end of the Rocky Mountain Division. In the early 1970s, as many as 8 trains per day ran through Avery and over the Bitterroots. E-78 leads the pack eastbound out of Avery, past the yard throat and under the highway bridge at the east end of town. A train length out of Avery, the engine slow for the caboose crew change back in Avery. The engineer of E-78 gets the highball by radio and notches up on the combined 14,000 horsepower to accelerate the train towards St. Paul Pass. The train picks up speed and dives into tunnel number 35, 2.5 miles east of Avery. Just out of tunnel number 32, the train negotiates the narrow shelf and crosses a trestle. The train barrels out of St. Paul Pass Tunnel at East Portal and glides down grade toward Saltese and the St. Regis River. Clouds of smoke pour out of the tunnel, while the Joe goes into regenerative braking, putting the downhill energy of the train back into the trolley and ultimately to another train or to Montana Power. The end of the train passes through East Portal and passes the crew houses, the substation, and the hotel. A westbound pair of Joes crosses the Saltese Trestle. E-78 continues eastbound. train speeds through Hagen. E78 crosses the Clark Fork River at St. Regis, Montana. It is dusk when E78 leads its train into Alberton. After a crew change, the train continues on its eastward journey. But the box cabs and Little Joes that so proudly ruled this electrified territory were not destined to remain. In less than 2 years, they were gone. The last Little Joe lowering its pantograph for a final time on June 15, 1974. Pentrex continues the story of the mighty Milwaukee Road with 2 additional volumes of vintage footage.